So it's time for my What Am I Sowing and Growing preview guide for November. And I say preview because I'm always refining my plans based on what happens to the September sowings and the October sowings. Things don't go to plan in gardening, and so sometimes you have to fix the things that went wrong in a month or 2 months later. And so that's why sometimes the guide that I'm talking about now, this preview guide, it will probably change by the time we get to November, but it won't change a lot. This is just my sort of generic advice, but in terms of what I'm actually doing, things change and evolve. So let's start here. So I'm just looking at my iPad. You can find the details of the database down below, and there we go. So hopefully now you can see my screen. And yeah, so I rambled on in the October guide about how I don't do onion sets over winter, red onion sets in particular over winter, because they're very unreliable. They tend to go to seed, and you don't do them basically unless you've had a previous year crop failure of your red onions like I did last year, and so it's worthwhile doing just to get some onions early. If you do choose to do them, the beginning of November I think is a more reliable time than in October, because they're less likely to go to seed on you, but you won't get them quite as early. So I don't do them, but if you wanted to do them, now would be probably the time. I also find it's worth doing a second succession of carrots to be harvested in June, just in case there's a problem with your March sown carrots, and you know, they'll be ready in June. So hopefully your March sown ones will be fine and you won't have any issues, but if you do have a few issues, it's nice to just have a few tubs of carrots, just in case you had a problem like slugs ate them all or something like that and you had to re-sow, and so you were a few weeks late, and so you've got a few extras. And I find it's just really nice to have just a few extra carrots basically, because even if you have got a March sown batch, the chances are they'll be really small when you start harvesting them. And so it's nice to have this sort of batch that you started back in November, which will be nice and big, and that'll just let your March ones just get a few extra weeks of growing, and so, you know, be quite considerably bigger than they would be if you harvested them really early. So I talked about this back again in the October video, but basically you just sow them, you leave them in polytunnel or your greenhouse. They'll only be tiny little plants overwintering, but that's fine. You don't want them to be very big. If they're bigger, you know, like this sort of size, they're likely to go to seed on you in spring. So you want them to be nice and little, and nice little plants will think that they're basically being sown in sort of February time, and so they're less likely to go to seed. A few still will, but not very many, maybe only sort of 5 or 10% of them. And put them outside in April, because by the time you get to sort of early April, it'll probably be too hot for them in the polytunnel. So I always put them outside. They do absolutely fine outside. I put them nice and high on top of my IBC tanks, away from carrot fly, and generally that's okay. So do my third succession of broad beans. First succession is in the polytunnel, just a fun early harvest, 2 or 3 weeks earlier than the second succession, which is outside. This is the third succession. I always start them in modules because otherwise the mice eat them. And you know, because it's getting quite cold by the time I'm planting these out, I might just put a little bit of fleece over them, just until they get established, and then generally speaking they're okay going through winter. Although last year we lost all of the inside and the outside broad beans because it got down to sort of -10 degrees, and that is just too cold. I think they're okay down to about -7, but -10, and well, they'd had it. I could have maybe got them through had I covered them with fleece during that really cold spell in December, but I suspect I probably couldn't, because, as I say, even in the polytunnel underneath polythene, they're still all died. I like to do my garlic in October, but not all beds will come free in October. It's still fine to do them in November, there won't be an issue. So basically, garlic is just one of those great things to plant in beds that start to come free. And obviously loads of beds are starting to come through free in November. And so just pop garlic in. But sometimes you can be kind of overly enthused by the idea of getting all your beds planted up for overwintered crops. It's important to remember if you plant your garlic in there, unless you harvest it as green garlic in April and early May, you are going to tie that bed up until the middle to the end of June, which means the primarily your peak growing season in sort of March through to June is all going to be sort of written off because you've got that garlic in there. So I tend to try and make sure that I'm only planting around the edges of beds at that time rather than the main beds, so that I've still got space to plant something else in the spring, because it's just really frustrating when you've got all these beds tied up with a relatively low value crop like garlic all the way through sort of peak growing season. So then I am doing 2 batches of lettuce, one conventional lettuces you might say, and the other one Salanovas. I'll just pop the varieties up there so you can see Grenoble Red, Riccia and Brighton. And for the Salanovas I'm doing multi-leaf Butterhead and incised leaf and extranet. And these are an experiment that I'm doing. So I'm doing them about 60 days under grow lights, which means they'll be pretty big plants, this sort of size plants, by the time I move them to the greenhouse. And I'm going to grow them on the greenhouse bench, maybe with a little bit of grow light, just for 2 or 3 hours a day. And I'm doing those so that in the middle of winter, if it's really grim and we don't want to travel to the allotment to harvest anything, we've got some lettuces at home in the greenhouse. I've never done this before because I've never had a greenhouse, but hopefully, I haven't got a greenhouse now either, but hopefully by the time we get to November I will have a greenhouse in the garden and I will have plenty of space in it. So I thought, yeah, let's put some in there, because we've generally planted up the kitchen garden in such a way that everything we need to get us through a week we can either harvest from the store or harvest fresh from the kitchen garden without coming to the allotment. Because last year there was some really bad weather in winter. Maybe there's always bad weather in winter, but anyway, last year was particularly bad weather in winter and we really didn't want to travel to the allotment. It's not very far away, but when the roads are icy and everything, it's just not worth doing. But it would have been easy just to pop out into the kitchen garden and harvest a few things. So this year we're doing that as an experiment. So I'm not recommending it, and if you wanted to do it, you've really got to have grow lights because it's really late in November to be starting lettuces. But if you've got grow lights, any month is a good month for starting things. You've just got to have somewhere to put them once you've started them. Grow lights aren't particularly great as a way to grow things to maturity, especially lettuces, because they do tend to get a bit of tip burn, and there's a whole load of reasons why that might happen. You can read about that in my ebook. And spinach though is different. So I do a batch of spinach, and I'll just put the varieties up there so you can see: Red Kitten, Responder and Rubino. And I do generally plant those out into one of my low tunnels or one of my coal frames that's come free. And that will tend to, if I'm starting these towards sort of early November, then I'm planting them out in early December, and I've had quite a lot of crops finish by then, and so I can plant my spinaches out, and I'll do just fine. It won't be affected by the cold, because immature spinach generally doesn't doesn't mind the cold at all, provided it's under cover. It does mind the wind, so it needs to be well protected from the wind, but it doesn't really mind much in the way of cold. and even down to -10 degrees that we had last year, all survived, didn't lose any spinach as a result of that. Spinach generally will survive down to -7, unprotected outside, not little immature plants, but more mature plants. But under cover, even though it might get below -7, as I say, because there's no wind chill or anything like that, it tends to survive just fine. And that again just gives me that really early spring harvest of my favourite spring varieties of spinach. And then finally, same sort of story with these lettuces. Again, I'll just pop up the varieties here. So Winter Density, Riccia, Canasta, Flashy Butteroak and Navara. Again, all of my favourite spring varieties. I'll start those ready to be planted out in December in a similar sort of scenario when beds are being cleared. And then these are my favourite spring varieties, and I get these again about a month earlier by using the grow light trick. So if you haven't got grow lights, just forget about it. But if you have got grow lights and you want to make best use of them in winter, then these are the sorts of things to do. I think lettuce, spinach, favourite varieties, and do those. And the benefit, and actually one of the reasons I got into all of this grow light thing, is because it's a real great way if you get seasonal effectiveness disorder, which I do. And so I do a few things to try and mitigate that. The first thing is I get really bright light in the morning. So first thing when I wake up, I've actually got grow lights in the bedroom because I start these seedlings up on the top of the wardrobe, out of the way. And that grow light kind of blasts out first thing in the morning. So when I wake up and open my eyes, I get this really bright light. And then I tend to go for a walk on the beach at sunrise. And again, I'm getting really nice bright light. The beach helps because obviously you're getting the reflection from the sand. You really can't get any brighter light outside than on a beach or paddling through the sea or something like that. And so that's really great in the morning. And I watch the sunset again on the beach at night, and again I really love that, and that kind of resets the whole circadian clock rhythm and everything works really well. And then during the day, when I'm in my den, conservatory is my den, and that's where I'm writing my book and just watching YouTube videos or whatever I'm doing. Again, I've got my grow lights in there, and that again just sort of gives me the impression psychologically, and probably some physiological thing going on as well, that I'm sitting in the conservatory on a sunny day. So I do quite a lot, but basically I've completely eliminated the seasonal effectiveness disorder, which used to be quite grim, to be honest, and so it's made a huge difference. And so it's a kind of a real bonus that I can also grow some food whilst fixing my seasonal effectiveness disorder. I see it as that way round, really. The growing of the food is very secondary to fixing the seasonal effectiveness disorder, and if you've ever had a SAD, then probably just how grim it can be and how great it is to get both of those benefits. Carry on gardening, watch your seedlings growing, and feel like you're sitting in a sunny room all day long. So that, I think, is me for November. And as I say, I do highly recommend that you subscribe to my newsletter. You can find it at steverichards.substack.com. You can find a link to it down below. But basically, it turns all of this very long, rambling video into nice, weekly, actionable chunks with loads more detail available to you if you want it, and no extra sort of superfluous detail if you don't. Links to all the appropriate chapters of my book that are relevant to all of the things that you're doing in that month. It just turns what can be quite an overwhelming hobby, gardening. There's so much going on with all these different successions, all these different pests, all these different diseases and all this sort of thing. So much going on. But when you look at it on a weekly basis, actually it's all really manageable. And so the newsletter tries to sort of reduce all that overwhelm, just give you exactly what you need for the week concerned, with a bit of a preview for the following week, and a few links to things to think about for the following month, and yeah, it makes it really quite manageable, I think. So my name's Steve, this is the Seaside Kitchen Garden and Allotment channel, and I'll see you soon.